Thank you so much, both Bob and Mark, for those generous comments and introduction. I'm thrilled to be back here at the NCAA convention. And please give a round of applause to President Emmer. I just think he's doing a fantastic job. Thank you so much for your leadership, Mark.
I just can't see you.
A few months ago, President Emmer said that 2011 was the best of times and the worst of times for college sports. I think he hit it right on the nail, hit the nail on the head. It was the best of times because college sports had never been more popular or more visible. It was the best of times because graduation rates for student athletes reached new highs and continued to surpass the graduation rate of their peers. And it was the best of times because college presidents took a major step to reduce academic abuses in Division I that have allowed rogue programs and coaches to taint the tremendous record of success of college sports for, I believe, far too long. And I can't thank the Division I college and university presidents enough for your decision to raise academic benchmarks that teams will have to meet to compete in the postseason. In just a few short years, teams will have to be on track to graduating at least half of their players to be eligible for postseason play, whether they compete in the NCAA basketball tournament or the BCS football bowl games. And as I'll talk about in a minute, raising the bar for postseason eligibility was literally a sea change in policy, though I was surprised to see a number of sports writers fail to catch its significance. And thanks to your collective commitment and leadership, the NCAA approved this unprecedented increase in postseason eligibility standards with record speed. Yet, it's also no secret why 2011 was also the worst of times for college sports. 2011 saw storied athletic programs hit hard by disturbing child sex abuse allegations, recruiting scandals, and rules violations. As President Emmert has pointed out, a year ago, no one dreamed that the head coaches at powerhouse athletic programs at Penn State, Ohio State, Tennessee, and North Carolina would be gone by the end of the year. Few also foresaw the full impact of the unprecedented multi-billion-dollar TV football contracts in the BCS and the madcap conference realignments that followed, with little or no regard for student athletes and what's best for their education. In the Big East, athletes will now fly from Boise to Boston and from San Diego to Stores and back again to compete. And I actually think it's hard to fly much further and still stay within the continental U.S. Last month, the Chronicle of Higher Education went so far as to publish a front-page story on intercollegiate athletics under the headline, "What in the hell has happened to college sports?" Now, to be clear, recruiting violations, academic fraud, stealing, violent crime, and child sex abuse are obviously all still exceptions in college sports programs. The overwhelming majority of institutions, including in the Division I revenue sports, run clean programs and are heavily subsidizing their teams, not the other way around. And I know that while coaches love to compete, it's very rare to find a college coach that does not care deeply about his players' character and their education. I've never understood how a coach could have high expectations for his or her players on the court, but somehow have low expectations off the court or field. Yet, like it or not, the scandals and the conference jockeying for dollars has created a disturbing and I think a dangerous narrative that all college leaders, college presidents, ADs, and coaches must grapple with today. The narrative in 2012 is that college sports is all about the deal. It's all about the brand. It's all about the big-time college football programs saying, "Show me the money." Too often, large, successful programs seem to exist in an insular world, a world of their own. Their football and basketball players, and sometimes even their coaches, are given license to behave in ways that would be unacceptable elsewhere in higher education or in the broader society at large. And nothing does more to corrode public faith in intercollegiate sports than the appearance of a double standard for coaches or athletes in big-time programs. Frankly, this narrative is a threat to the core principles of the NCAA, the mission of higher education, and the amateur tradition. And I believe without decisive action by college leaders, that storyline and the challenges it creates is likely to become even more embedded in the public's mind. In the next couple of years, television media revenues for the top 5 conferences will likely more than double. Coaches making $5 million a year could, one day soon, be at $10 million a year. Nearly 40 assistant football coaches in the FBS now earn more than $400,000 a year. I think that's about what my boss earns, the President of the United States, each year. It's hard to think of a nonprofit, much less an educational nonprofit, where such exorbitant salaries wouldn't create an outcry. In one BCS conference, institutions are now spending nearly 12 times as much on athletic spending per athlete as they are on academic spending per student. And I can't tell you exactly what that ratio should be or how much more out of whack it might get, but without a concerted collective effort to slow runaway spending in revenue sports, I think that problem is just going to continue to get worse. Barring action to moderate the athletic arms race, the pressures to build more gilded athletic facilities will grow, even as other campus infrastructure deteriorates, and even as faculty and non-athletic staff face salary freezes and furloughs and layoffs. Meanwhile, antitrust challenges are advancing in the courts that also threaten the amateur traditions of college sports. That is the path which big-time college sports are on today. And I think we all know where that movie ends. But with your leadership, I absolutely believe institutions of higher education and the NCAA can create a very different path. You can implement far-reaching reforms to reassert the educational mission of universities and colleges. You can reaffirm the NCAA's principle that the educational experience of the student-athlete is paramount. Just as is the case in K-12 education, the baseline litmus test about reforms should be, is this good for students? Not, is it good for adults or coaches or AD or alumni and boosters? And I know you can create a better model of intercollegiate sports for the 21st century that strikes a healthier balance between academics and athletics, and that does more to both incentivize good behavior and to penalize rogue programs and coaches and players. I believe you can overhaul the NCAA's crazily complex rule book and make it a much less complex issue to understand. Here's what I don't believe. I don't believe that you can meet these challenges by doing business as usual, by pushing legislation through the NCAA that takes literally years to be approved and that often ends up watered down to the lowest common denominator. I don't believe you can strike a healthier balance between athletics and academics without courageous leadership that may take you outside your comfort zone, including making decisions that may be the right thing to do for students, but may not necessarily maximize the inference of your conference. And I don't believe you'll get this perfect. Perfection can't be the goal. I don't believe you'll put an end to the commercialization in revenue sports and the competitive financial advantages on the playing field or court. I don't believe that all recruiting violations will somehow miraculously cease. But striking a healthier balance between athletics and academics doesn't mean that the needs of athletic programs will disappear or that somehow they'll become less vital. Please challenge the status quo, not in the pursuit of perfection, but to better align your work with your internal moral compass, with what you know in your heart is right. This, we all know, is going to be tough and challenging and controversial work. The intense competitive pressures and the alumni pressure that many college presidents, coaches, and ADs work under every single day is real. But the difficulty of change cannot become an excuse for throwing in the towel on strengthening the collegiate sports model. Before I talk a bit about what a better model might look like, I want to be clear that I come here today not as a critic, but as an absolute believer in the extraordinary value of college sports. As Bob said, I learned firsthand about the importance and the impact from my own experience, and also from my family. I'm still extraordinarily grateful to my coaches for the opportunities they gave me when I played college basketball. The lessons and the friendships that I gained as a student athlete have shaped me throughout the entire course of my life in profound ways. We all know student athletes often spend more time with their coaches than they do with any professor during their college years. And great coaches, just like great teachers, transform the lives of their students. My sister, who is actually a much better basketball player than I am, also played Division I, and she was an early beneficiary of Title IX. Maintaining Title IX, maintaining sports opportunities for women, is not a legal abstraction to me. I saw how Title IX transformed college sports for the better. My mother, who was actually the best athlete in our family, went to college obviously during the pre-Title IX years and didn't have those kinds of opportunities. Some of you may also know that my dad was the faculty representative to the NCAA at the University of Chicago for more than 25 years. And I remember him coming home from the NCAA conventions and coming home and having animated discussions with us and recounting the debates that took place at these types of events. And I love those dinner time conversations. And my dad instilled in me the understanding that the mission of a university was a dual mission: to educate its students and to prepare them for life. If a college fails to educate all of its students, if it fails to give them a chance to learn and to grow, then that university has failed in its mission. Yet, when academic programs do have their priorities in order, I believe there's no better way to teach invaluable life lessons than on the playing field or on the court. It is the ideal training ground for learning the skills of discipline, resilience, selflessness, taking responsibility, and above all, leadership. Like most student athletes, I felt it was an unbelievable privilege and an honor to represent my university, not in any way some form of exploitation. So growing up on the south side of Chicago, I got to see both the best that college sports had to offer and unfortunately some of the worst. I played with inner city stars who had been used and ultimately dumped by their universities. At the end of the day, they had nothing to show for the wins, the championships, and the revenue they brought to their schools. When the ball stopped bouncing for them, they had very few opportunities in life. They struggled to find work, had difficult lives, and unfortunately, some died early. Advocates of pay-to-play seem to assume that a full athletic scholarship is a small reward for the health risks that athletes assume and the financial rewards reaped by successful college sports programs. But that is not my experience, and that is not my belief. The clear dividing line for success in life among the inner city kids who I played with and grew up with was between those who went to school and got their degrees and those who did not. Everyone here today knows that just a tiny percent of Division I players will ever go on to the pros. But getting that degree can change the course of their lives and their families' lives forever. To restore a healthier balance between athletics and academics in the revenue sports, I would encourage college leaders to begin changing policies that clearly fail to put the interests of student athletes first. Let me cite a couple of concrete examples. And I don't think it's a problem per se that BCS conferences have negotiated lucrative television contracts for their football teams. In a number of instances, those contracts have actually allowed athletic programs to stop being financial drains on their universities, freeing up more institutional resources for academic purposes. However, I think it is a problem that the BCS conferences use 0% of their bowl game revenues for educational components or to support student academic success. By contrast, the NCAA has at least some ties to educational goals in its revenue distribution formula for the March Madness basketball tournament. And I believe the NCAA tournament revenue formula should be revised to do more to reward teams that don't shortchange academics, and that less revenue should be rewarded based solely on wins on the court. At present, the NCAA awards about $1.4 million to conferences each time one of their teams wins a game in the tournament. The BCS awards even more, $20 million a win to a conference for each BCS bowl victory. There has to be a better way to distribute postseason revenues in a manner that does more to support the educational mission of those universities. Finally, creating a better balance between academics and athletics also requires an overhauling of the NCAA's rule book and enforcement procedures, which too often undermine faith in the NCAA and cast doubts on the viability of the amateur ethos. At 426 pages, I think the NCAA Division I rule book is about half again longer than the New Testament. It contains 2.5 pages that outline the NCAA's principles of conduct, followed by 400 plus pages of rules. And it's so complex that not even compliance personnel in athletic departments can begin to know all of the rules. More than a few rules edge towards the ridiculous. The rule book contains 3 pages on the size of envelope that institutions are allowed to use to send mailings to prospective student athletes. Several years ago, the University of Maryland ran afoul of the NCAA rule that promotional pamphlets for athletes can only use 3 colors. Their offense, it turns out that the state seal of Maryland actually has 4 colors. And who can forget the urgent controversy over a bylaw that allows an institution to provide a bagel to a student athlete as a snack? The problem is that bagels with cream cheese must count as an allowable meal. But fear not, this year's legislative cycle includes a proposal to permit bagel spreads. Almost everyone, including NCAA leaders, think the NCAA needs to have a simpler and a shorter set of rules with meaningful sanctions for coaches, ADs, programs, and athletes that violate the NCAA's core principles. As the NCAA Enforcement Working Group has recommended, enforcement needs to distinguish between egregious violations, serious violations, and minor or technical violations. So in the spirit of promoting reforms to enhance the educational purposes of the university, let me throw out 4 additional steps beyond overhauling rules and enforcement that could support student-athlete success, most of which the NCAA is already taking action on and is providing great leadership. I want to be clear here that I'm not endorsing a specific course of action or program for the NCAA or its member institutions. These are simply broad brush strokes. They are meant to encourage a national dialogue among college leaders about steps that might be taken to incentivize the right priorities in big-time sports. You, all of you here, are the true experts, and I'm convinced that you will come up with many new creative solutions. First, as I mentioned, the BCS conference should set aside a meaningful share of bowl revenues for an academic enhancement fund that supports the education of its student athletes. The NCAA has no control over bowl revenues, so this would be a decision each conference would have to make. There are models out there to look at, from the Knight Commission's proposed Academic Athletics Balance Fund to the NCAA's Degree Completion Awards Program, which enables athletes to return to get their degrees after their 5-year eligibility periods are over. Second, too many special admits are not capable of doing college work and competing on day one when they land in college. In October, the NCAA Division I Board of Directors approved creating a freshman academic red shirt for academically ineligible students, which would allow them the time and the education to handle college coursework before they could compete. If students can't do college work, even with assistance, they shouldn't be playing sports until they are academically ready. An academic redshirt period would also reduce the number of unprepared basketball recruits who enroll with the false expectation that they'll be one-and-done players, which makes an absolute mockery of the idea that they are college students at all. When the academic redshirt year proposal is implemented in 2015, I think it will have a bigger impact than many people today realize. Up to 1/3 of FBS football players and 43% of Division I basketball players may be required to serve an academic redshirt year. And finally, the NCAA convention has 2 proposals up for review. One would allow schools to provide multi-year scholarships. A second proposal would allow conferences to provide up to $2,000 in additional scholarship aid up to the full cost of attendance. I know these proposals have met with some opposition. They may need to be modified to comply with Title IX. A number of FBS schools have objected on the grounds that the proposals could cause a financial strain and put colleges at smaller FBS programs at a competitive disadvantage. I don't know what the NCAA membership will ultimately decide about these initiatives, but it seems clear that they are steps in the right direction to protect student athletes and put their interests first. I don't see how coaches jettisoning scholarship athletes is any time going to be in the best interest of those students. And I expect that some sports writers and coaches will contend the directions for reform that I've sketched out today are naive. But I would counter that it's the skeptics who have been largely bamboozled. They have bought into the myth that the only way to win a national title is to cut academic corners, and they claim that big money and the competitive pressures will ultimately sweep aside all attempts to protect the educational interests of student athletes. Simply put, I don't think history bears them out. And I congratulate the Crimson Tide on winning the BCS championship on Monday night. But don't forget that both Alabama and LSU football teams have excellent academic records, with graduation rates around 70% and APRs above 960. And don't forget that when the NCAA raised eligibility standards for student athletes with Proposition 48, there was a firestorm of opposition. Some critics said minority athletes would be denied the opportunity to go to college and would be victimized by their inferior high schools that they were forced to attend. The critics, I think, exaggerated. After an initial small dip in black participation, the sky did not fall, and the proportion of black male players in Division I basketball and football subsequently increased. Very significantly, high school minority student athletes take more college prep classes today than before. They achieve higher GPAs, they score higher on standardized tests, and ultimately they graduate at a higher rate from college. High schools, coaches, and minority athletes rose to the challenge of higher standards. Raising expectations, raising the bar is always the right way to go, not dumbing things down. And as some of you may recall, last spring I supported the Knight Commission's longstanding recommendation that teams should be on track to graduate at least half, just 1 out of every 2 of their players, to be eligible for postseason play. And frankly, I see this simply as a starting point, not as the ultimate goal. But one Hall of Fame basketball coach told USA Today that the proposal in my endorsement was, and I quote, completely nuts. 6 months later, thankfully, some similarly deranged Division I college presidents overwhelmingly approved that measure. So I have every faith that when the NCAA and the BCS conferences step up and say, we're going to draw a line in the sand about academic outcomes, you will see behavior change rapidly. If the metric of being on track to a 50% graduation rate was used in last year's basketball tournament, the national champion, Connecticut, would have been ineligible to participate. 5 of this year's 70 teams in the BCS Bowl games would have also been ineligible. Just think of the profound impact that policy is going to have on coaches and athletic departments and the emphasis that they place on academic success. And I guarantee you that no coach will want to walk into his locker room and tell his players, even though we have a chance to win the national title this year, we can't compete in the postseason because our players didn't work hard enough in the classroom. Incentives matter. And I guarantee you no coach will want to walk into the president's office and say, we can't compete in a BCS bowl game, and I'm sorry, our conference isn't eligible for that $20 million victory prize. So to all the Division I college leaders here today, I absolutely applaud the reforms you've approved in recent months and the direction of new reforms you are currently considering. Keep going, and please resist the temptation to tinker or temper with your core principles. Many Division II leaders are also here today as well, and they have set a leading example of the power of collective action. It's true that Division II programs don't have to manage lucrative football TV revenues, but Division II programs also face competitive pressures that could easily pull them away from their values if they were not vigilant. Acting together, Division II presidents have created a better balanced college experience for their student athletes. They have shortened the playing season, allow fewer competitions during the school year, and have a no games, no practice break in December. In the end, I'm convinced doing the right thing in college sports is not really that complicated an intellectual challenge. This does not take a Nobel laureate to solve. College presidents know what advances education for student athletes, and they know what undermines it. And I'd be the first to acknowledge that college sports reform is a tough political challenge on your campuses. But ultimately, this is a challenge of leadership. And leading your campus and leading your programs is the reason that so many of you signed up for the job. Working collectively, with conviction and with courage, and a willingness to step outside your comfort zones, I believe you will create a better balance between athletics and academics. And I'm convinced now is the time for Division I leaders and the NCAA to step forward and reassert the interests of student athletes and advance the educational mission of your institutions, and in doing that, regain the public's trust and the public's respect. And it's time to raise your game. It's time to bring your A game for success in athletics and in academics, on the field and off. Thank you so much for having me this afternoon, and I look forward to your questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, Secretary Duncan has agreed to take questions from the audience. We have a mic stand here on the right side and one on the left side as well. So if you have any questions, please approach the mic stand and identify yourself and ask your question. Questions?
Bob. Drew Bogner from Malloy College. I happen to be the chair of Division II, so I appreciate your comments on what we've been doing in Division II, Senator Duncan. And I also want to thank you for your rallying cry to support what we've been talking about within the whole association. I've had the opportunity to be a part of some of those discussions with my D1 colleagues, and I really do appreciate the courage they've shown. But the question I have for you really has to do with the federal government's role in this conversation. I think we understand what we need to do in many ways, but it seems with some regularity, I hear about the government's necessity to get involved, whether that's the Congress looking into the BCS championship or anything of that nature. So I guess in addition to your encouragement, I'm wondering whether you can tell us what role you see the federal government having in this, or is this really our concern as an association?
It's a great question. I really fully think it is your concern. And if any of us are looking for Congress to solve anything these days, good luck. So Congress is not the answer here. I think Congress steps in when they feel pressure from their constituents, from their communities. But this is not a place where we should do anything. The Education Department, where I think Congress needs to do something. I think this is a chance for you guys as leaders to step up and do the right thing. And frankly, the more you do that, I think the more you mitigate the chances of Congress getting engaged.
Secretary Duncan, Chris Comfort from Moravian College, and I represent the vast majority of the NCAA, which is actually in Division III. Seriously, preliminary report shows that in Division III, men and women athletes are outperforming other students.
Yeah.
So we're very proud of our incorporation of education through athletics as opposed to in spite of it or in opposition to it. Having given my little speech, I'd be curious from your experience as an athlete, what are one or two virtues that you believe all of us, as college presidents, coaches, athletic directors, members of the faculty, should really focus on?
First of all, I want to say I'm a huge proponent of the Division III experience. As I said, my dad was at the University of Chicago for about 40 years, was a faculty representative, I think, for 26, 27 years. I grew up going to those basketball games and football games from the time I was a little child. Those are just amazing memories from my youth. And I think there's so much that you guys do right and have these things in balance where, frankly, some of the more higher profile Division I conferences get out of whack. I go back to, I said before, outside the military, I can't think of a better training ground for future leaders than intercollegiate athletics. I think it's an amazing opportunity that's difficult to replicate in the chemistry lab or in some other place. If you look at leaders around the country, a disproportionate number of, whether it's political leaders or CEOs, were former college athletes. I think it's absolutely invaluable. And at the end of the day, I think everyone really knows, I honestly believe this is not that intellectually complicated. I think people know what's right and wrong. I think like in other walks of life, when money gets involved, money changes behavior in ways where we lose our moral compass. And I think Division III has stayed as true to that as anybody. I think Division II is doing a great job. I think Division I has some lessons to learn from what Division II and Division III are doing.
Yes, Secretary Duncan, Carlisle Carter with the California Community Colleges. And my first question is, who has the better shot, you or President Obama?
I plead the fifth.
And my second question, obviously, is more serious. With the academic reforms, we may see more and more students attending colleges at the two-year level looking to remediate. Could you expand on the idea of the role of the two-year colleges in remediation? We know that the basic skill level of students coming out of high school is lacking.
Yeah, so let me say a couple things. A big part of my job is to ultimately try and get both four-year institutions and community colleges out of the remediation business. And we have to get K-12 doing a much better job of making sure their graduates are college and career ready. So we're spending a lot of time and energy working on that. You guys are remediating high schools remediating elementary schools, goes all the way down. We have to, as a system, do a much better job of making sure students graduate from high school with the skills they need to be successful. And that's a much longer conversation, but there's actually been some very significant movement. Quickly, 46 states have voluntarily adopted college and career ready standards for the first time ever in our nation's history. They used to dummy standards down because it made politicians look good. We've seen a huge movement there. But having said all that, in the short term, there's still going to be a need for remediation. None of this is an overnight success. I'm just a huge, huge proponent of the community college experience. I think the great education's there. I think given the cost pressures at four-year institutions, particularly for non-athletes, it's a much more financially viable option. It's interesting, in a tough job climate, I'm actually seeing more and more young people with four-year degrees going back to community colleges to get the real skills they need to go get a good paying job. So we've done a ton to try and support community colleges. $2 billion investment with the Department of Labor. My Undersecretary Martha Cantor is a former community college president. No one's ever come to the community college world at that level. That was very strategic. So we're doing everything we can to shine a spotlight on community colleges, continue to help you increase your capacity, continue to help you increase your completion rates, as well as make sure those young people or 58-year-olds who want to get a good job are prepared when they leave. But I think community colleges are a huge part of the solution and have been this unpolished or unrecognized gem along the education continuum.
Secretary Duncan, my name is Scott Croft. I'm a track and field student athlete and the chair of the Division I Student Athlete Advisory Committee. My question for you is, there's a number of student athlete leaders here meeting at the convention, and what role do you envision that student athletes can play in your philosophy and the entire advancement of Division I, II, and III athletics?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for your leadership. And again, I think you guys are sort of this next generation of leaders, and you guys stepping up as undergraduates, I think is pretty extraordinary. I think whatever you guys can do to have your voices heard by university presidents and by boards of trustees about what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. The fact that it was controversial to say that 1 and 2 of your players have to be able to graduate over a 6-year period or whatever it is in order to go into the postseason, that to me is like common sense. But these changes are really, really hard. There are lots of entrenched interests that want to keep the status quo the same. But I think the more student athletes are advocating for the right things and the right values and saying you want to have an extraordinary athletic experience, but that academics have to come first, I think that voice being heard would be very, very powerful, and appreciate you guys stepping up.
Hi, Secretary Duncan. I'm Dana Thomas, NCAA staff, and Scott pretty much took my question, but echoing that a little bit, with all the student athletes in here, can you tell them what they should be embracing right now as collegiate student athletes and preparing them for their future? What helped you along the way?
Well, I think they're in great shape. Again, I just think for all the student athletes here, it's just an amazing privilege, and I think there's so many, the experience that I was lucky enough to have and that they're having now is such an invaluable learning opportunity. I hope they cherish every minute. It flies by. It goes by too quick. Soak it up. But you don't have to wait till you're 25 or 35 or 45 to be a leader. And the more their voices are heard now, the more it's not just top down, whether it's me chirping or whether it's the leadership that Mark's providing, but the more student athletes are being heard by their ADs, by their university presidents, by their boards of trustees. That voice, frankly, has probably been missing from the conversation. I think it's an extraordinarily powerful voice, and would love to have that heard more often.
Secretary Duncan, how you doing? My name is Demario Solomon Simmons. I'm an attorney from Tulsa, Oklahoma, a former student athlete, football player at the University of Oklahoma. And you stated that you don't think the Department of Education has a big role in this issue, but do you think that your office could play a role in bringing a summit together of all the different stakeholders, the media, the student athletes, the universities, the advocacy groups, the academics, everyone that's looking at this issue to come together in a summit and a round table and really deal with these things and come to some resolutions together with all the different perspectives.
If that kind of thing would be interesting, I'd be happy to do something like that. I honestly believe that folks are on the right track here. And for me, the big thing is just moving with greater urgency. We sort of joked about the bagels, but I think so often, historically, it took 2, 3, 4 years for basic changes to happen in NCAA guidelines. And so I think what you've seen recently is the NCAA moving at a speed that I haven't seen in a long, long time. And so I think things are on the right track. We have to keep moving forward. You need to make sure the rug doesn't get pulled from underneath those reforms. But whether it's us facilitating or convening or just simply participating in sort of discussions of this, I personally find it really, really interesting. If that'd be valuable, I'm happy to consider it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Stephen Jordan, President of Metropolitan State College of Denver. I appreciate your reference to the importance of Title IX and accomplishments. Since 2000, there's literally been no improvement in proportional representation for women in participation in sports in the NCAA. Many of us believe it was because of the interpretations that were being used by the prior administration. Would you speak to where you see this administration going with interpretation of Title IX?
Yeah, happy to. Russell Ali runs our Office of Civil Rights, does an amazing job. Happy to connect you guys directly, but we actually did a Twitter town hall, which was pretty courageous of us the other day, and talked about Title IX being one of the most one of the most important civil rights piece of legislation ever passed. And we think it's a huge deal. We want to continue to enforce. For me, it goes way beyond athletics. It goes to the STEM fields. It goes to access to higher ed. And we want to do everything we can to support the movement and the difference it's made. And when you look at sort of the history, my numbers aren't going to be exact, but 7-fold increase in the number of young women participating in college sports, 10-fold increase, I think, in women participating at the high school level. Just unimaginable what the world was like before. And as I said, people like my mother didn't have those opportunities. People like my sister did, so I've seen it very personally. And so happy to continue the conversation with wrestling, but we want to do everything we can to be an advocate and make sure we're increasing opportunities, not just around intercollegiate athletics, but in other areas of underrepresentation, like the STEM fields.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.